Hi guys, we're back onto our next section, and that is continuing from yesterday. Let's look at terminology, and you're adding onto your page. Synapse. Onto your terminology page, you're looking at synapse, guys. Synaptic contact and the neurotransmitter. Again, we're back onto the structure of the motor neuron. We drew and labeled the motor neuron yesterday. But just to recap, function of dendrites, which you're now going to put in your notes in a different color, like we do in annotated diagram, to pick up nerve impulse transmission. So it's going to receive it. You can see here that I've put it already. Let's highlight that. And that is its function. Let's go to node of Ranvier. Function, speed up impulse transmission. Now if we look at the nodes of Ranvier, I want you to look at the Schwann cells. If you recall, I told you that this is called a Schwann cell yesterday, and it's pinched. Wherever it's pinched, that's called a node of Ranvier. Its main function is to speed up nerve impulse transmission. Around the end, over it, I told you that we have this little membrane called the neurolemma. Are you still with me? We're on textbook page 106. We're looking there at the diagrams that I've drawn for you. And we look at the neurolemma and myelin trees, both of which is to speed up impulse transmission and insulation. I told you it's very much like the insulation tape. The fatty layer is like an insulation tape that's protecting the entire axon. This is called the terminal branches. Terminal, how will you remember? The best way to remember is terminal, meaning end. So at the end of a neuron, you will have terminal branches. Okay. Then we know about nucleus, and we know that this is the cell body, which we did yesterday, and this long part is our axon. All right, good people. I want to draw your attention now to this gap here. So this is one neuron. This is the motor neuron, and you can see from its structure that it has many outgrowths. If you look at the cell body, look at the outgrowths here. It's got many dendrites and it's got an axon. Therefore, we call it multipolar. It's a multipolar neuron. Now, at the end of the neuron, there will be terminal branches. There will be another neuron here. So neurons are not in complete contact with each other. So when you got the next neuron around this side, you'll have a cell body of it and the axon after that. What you need to focus on right now is that there's a gap, there's a microscopic gap between the terminal branches and of one axon, of one neuron, and the dendrites of the next neuron. That microscopic gap is called a synapse. So we can go back now to our terminology, and you can add in at synapse microscopic gap between two neurons. Okay, let's do this again. This is the motor neuron. It's multipolar in its structure because it has many multipolar, meaning many outgrowths. You've got the dendrite, you've got the axon. This is the terminal branch because it's the end of the neuron. Next to it, there's a microscopic gap. The gap is called a synapse. And then there's a cell body of another neuron around here. Synapse is a gap. microscopic gap, or they call it a juncture or junction. Now, let's look at how the impulse will travel. The dendrites will stand upright. It will pick up the impulse. It will pass it from there onto the axon. Here it does not go from Schwann cell to Schwann cell. It will jump from Ranvier to Ranvier, from many Ranviers. That's why we say impulse transmission is fast by the node of Ranvier. So it's speeded up and goes to the end plates. Now it needs to go onto the dendrites of the next neuron. So it needs to jump over the synapse. At the end of this structure here, at the end of the end plates, there's a structure there that produces something called a neurotransmitter. What is a neurotransmitter? A neurotransmitter is a chemical that's produced by the end plates. And what does this chemical do? It makes the next dendrites of the next neuron susceptible to receive the impulse. So it allows this neuron that's there, the dendrites, to stand upright or reach out and catch the impulse as it jumps over the synapse. That's what a neurotransmitter is. The amount of neurotransmitter that's been released is controlled by your brain. There are many different neurotransmitters. The miracle part of this is that it has to be released at the exact time when the impulse comes in. And so that will tell you how fast it must be released. One of the neurotransmitter, which is not for exam purposes, but just for interest, is called acetylcholine. So when acetylcholine is released by this motor end plate, by the end of the terminal branches, and the motor neuron, or any neuron, the end of the branch, it will cause the dendrites of the next neuron to be receptive and catch the impulse as it jumps across to the end plate, across the synapse, which is an invisible gap, onto the dendrites of the next neuron. We say then that this neuron has made synaptic contact with each other. So synaptic contact is where the neuron, the impulse, is able to make communication with the next neuron through the synapse. So synaptic contact, again, is communication between two neurons. And what is being released for this to happen is called a neurotransmitter. I was speaking to you about acetylcholine, which is not for examination purposes, but to tell you a little bit about this. I just want to tell you a little bit because there's so much of stigma attached onto depression. Now, if insufficient amount of neurotransmitter is produced, this will cause a delay in impulse transmission. If the neurotransmitter is released too late or insufficiently, it will not cause the impulse to jump through the node of Ranvier, through the terminal branch, through the synaptic gap, and make synaptic gap and make synaptic contact with the next neuron. And that state, that physiological state, is called depression. And what do antidepressants do? They feed the end plates, they feed these knobs with one of the neurotransmitters. And we look at acetylcholine, there's many others. And then this allows for the transmission to take place smoother. So now you know that depression is not something that you choose. It is a physiological process or chemical imbalance in your body. That's just for interest. And now that you're going under a lot of stress with this lockdown and being in Madrid, it's easy to slip into worry and a little bit of depression. But guess what? You're not alone. All right, let's look at this neuron. This is what a sensory neuron looks like. Now, the sensory neuron is exactly, its structure is it's got the same structure as, same parts of the motor neuron. The only difference is that the sensory neuron is known as unipolar in structure because coming out of the cell body, it's just got one growth. Can you see that there? It's only got one growth. Therefore, it's called a unipolar neuron in structure. And exams like to ask, people who are studying your papers love to ask, point to the eye or the ear and ask you to draw the neuron that's associated in that area or present in that area. Any part of your sensory organs will have a sensory neuron. All right, so here we have the cell body, and outgrowth, the dendrites, and then your axon moving away. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, I want to recap with you now to make sure that you know what's happening. Let's try together. Yes? What's this label? Dendrites. Well done. Function? To pick up nerve impulse transmission and pass it on through the cell body to this long part that's called an axon. This part here is called your cell body. And the long part that's moving away from the neuron is called your axon. And I know that you're smart. We're going to put down a label or caption for this diagram. Structure of a motor neuron. How are we doing, good people? Are you coping? Let's underline it so it looks a bit neater. And if you can notice, my handwriting is getting a little bit better. All right. So here's our axon now. Here's our Schwann cells. This here. This part that's pinched in is your node of Rensia to increase or speed up impulse transmission. And there you have your terminal branches. We can label terminal branches. Are we all right, good people? Terminal branches. And can any of you guess what's the structure here? We know it's a motor neuron. We know it's multipolar. Can you guess? That's right. That's your muscle. Well done. So you can see that the terminal branches of the motor neuron ends in the muscle. Let's move on. And there it's done again. Number 1, you can label yourself. Number 2, number 3, number 4, muscle. Number 5, to get it right, synapse. To get this one right, that's your synapse. Do you remember this word we done this morning? What is the synapse? It is a microscopic gap between two neurons. To be more specific, it is a microscopic gap or junction between the end plates or the terminal branches of one neuron and the dendrites of another. What's synaptic contact? This is the communication when this impulse jumps over. We call that synaptic contact. And what is our neurotransmitter? It's a substance release that enables this synaptic contact to take place. Choppy chop. All right, let's move on to the next slide. And this is just to give you a brief, an overall idea of what neurons look like. Because remember, we haven't really started with the brain. We're just recapping grade 10 work. So here's your motor neuron, cell body, axon. The arrow is showing you the direction in which the impulse is moving. Here's your terminal branches. Look at your sensory neuron, unipolar. You see one growth there. And then you got your dendrites, and you got your axon this way. So that one is unipolar. And then look what the interneuron looks like. Okay, quickly, let's recap. Motor neuron, a sensory neuron, interneuron. Sensory neuron, from the sense organs to the brain and spinal cord. Motor neuron, from the brain and spinal cord to the muscle. And what's interneuron? Also known as connector neuron. It's connecting the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Are we all right, good people? I trust that you're okay. And now this is a little mind map that I've got for you. Let's just go through it briefly. Here's our nervous system. Initially, I introduced to you the central nervous system. Let's look at it here. We'll use a highlighter, and let's use orange. Oh, let's use purple to make it more exciting. Here's your central nervous system. And you got your PNS. Do you remember me telling you yesterday, PNS and CNS? Please, this is not some TV station. Be clever. Central nervous system, CNS, peripheral nervous system. Let's look at what the central nervous system is made of. Brain and spinal cord. And what's our PNS made up of? Our neurons. Then we're still going to do our sense organs. We're going to do ailments, different types of ailments. We may not do these ones, but we're going to discuss it. All right, so that's where we stop right now. And then your next lesson, get ready. We're going to be starting with the brain. I'm quite excited about it. So get your cranium ready. Get your cerebrum ready so you can be indulging in higher order thinking. And I look forward to meeting you in our next lesson. I'm proud of you guys. Keep going. Love you. Take care.